Before we begin, allow me to remind everyone that this talk will be recorded and the Q&A session will not. Our conversation will be held under the Chatham House rule. Participants are to use information shared, but are not attributed to specific individuals. In addition, please keep comments and questions short and to the point, as others will want to participate. Please do not lecture the speaker. Our speaker, Dr. Kamran Bokhari, is a senior director at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy in Washington, D.C., of which he is a key founder. Previously, he served as New Lines Institute Director of Analytical Development and played a pivotal role in establishing the Institute's graduate program in strategy and policy. Dr. Bokhari also is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University and publishes a weekly essay for Geopolitical Futures, which of course is one successor organization to Stratfor. He has served as the Central Area Studies course coordinator at U.S. State Department's Foreign Service Institute and has 15 years and more of experience in the private sector intelligence space, during which he provided intellectual leadership in the publishing of cutting-edge geopolitical analyses and strategic forecasts. His core area of expertise are strategic intelligence analysis, foreign policy and national security, and Eurasian geopolitics, among many other fields of study. He is the author of Political Islam in the Age of Democratization, 2013. He has also contributed chapters to a number of edited volumes, including Strategic Analysis in Support of International Policymaking and the Oxford Handbook on Islam and Politics. Today's talk is on India-Pakistan conflict, key arena for U.S. China competition. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Kamran Bokhari to the Mackinder Forum. Please begin.
Well, thank you for that warm welcome, Len, and thank you everybody who took their time out on a Friday afternoon to attend. I really appreciate it. So Len has already stated the topic, and you're well aware of it. The way I'm going to go about it, and I sort of wanted to explain my sort of approach to this. This is a complicated topic. We're not just talking about India-Pakistan conflict, but we're overlaying it on the broader U.S. China competition that's underway. So I was thinking, what is the best way to present this material? And then, I realized I was doing this for the Mackinder Forum and maps. So I'm going to start off with geography, a bunch of maps. Then I'm going to run through the history, bring us to the present, and give you sort of my net assessment of the current moment, both in terms of the smaller battle space of India-Pakistan and the wider battle space between China and the United States. All right, so I mean, the best place to begin for an India-Pakistan conflict is obviously the region of Kashmir. And it's a complicated region, primarily because it's been sliced and diced over the decades. But we generally tend to think of it as sort of the primary arena between the Indians and the Pakistanis. But fewer people know that China has a huge stake in this territory and actually occupies a good chunk of the territory. Not as much as India and Pakistan, but still. So let me just flip to that map. So, barring the yellow color or yellowish color that shows Pakistan and India proper, and then the gray of China and Afghanistan and Tajikistan, everything else is Kashmir. And so the question is where to begin? Well, if you look at the blue dotted line is what is called the line of control. And that's been in place since at least formally since the 1972 Simla Accord between the two countries. And so on the Western side or on the Pakistani side, you see two different territories. One is what is called Azad Kashmir. Azad just literally means free in the South Asian language, and which is common to India and Pakistan. So what that means is free Kashmir. Notice it's a very small finger-like territory, and that's what the Pakistanis refer to as their Kashmir, or Kashmir that's under their control. The bulk of Pakistani-controlled Kashmir is called Gilgit-Baltistan. That's a new name that that region got, and you can see how it's much bigger. It touches, the Wakhan corridor in Afghanistan. It touches a large, there's a significant border with Xinjiang region of China. And of course, it hugs the line of control. So Gilgit-Baltistan is basically, there's a Baltistan area, there's a Gilgit area. The Pakistanis, somewhere around 2009, decided that they will call this Gilgit-Baltistan. It was a move by Parliament. Until then, what we now see as Gilgit-Baltistan was called FANA. FANA was the acronym, which meant Federally Administered Northern Areas, or Northern Area as in the singular. And so and this is a high altitude mountainous region, and Azad Kashmir is the same, but this is sort of the bulk of Pakistan administered Kashmir, or Pakistan controlled Kashmir. Now let's flip over to the Indian side. So from the end of the 1947-48 war, which we'll get into detail here in a bit, until 2019, the area was called the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Now, mind you, India claims all of Kashmir that you're seeing on your map. The area is controlled by the Chinese in light green. The area is controlled by Pakistan, that grayish area called the Siachen Glacier, which I'll get to here in a bit. And of course, the area that is marked Jammu and Kashmir, and Ladakh, which is next to Chinese controlled territory. So India claims all of that as its own. But what it controlled for the longest time, from 48 all the way to 2019, was a singular territory that essentially was one state. It had an autonomous status. It had its own, regional elections and whatnot. But nonetheless, it was a singular territory. In 2019, which is when the recent tensions with both Pakistan and India flared up into their current status of heightened tensions, what the Indians did is they did two things. One is they rescinded the autonomous status of their state of Jammu and Kashmir, and divided into two centrally ruled or centrally overseen union territories. So one is Jammu and Kashmir, and that's sort of in that light beige, and then there's the yellowish beige, which is Ladakh. So Ladakh and Jammu and Kashmir are the two administrative regions that form the old state of Jammu and Kashmir. So if that wasn't complicated enough, what you have is Aksai Chin and Demchok, and the areas that touch Tibet. Those are controlled by the Chinese, and you can see it's a pretty substantial amount of territory. This is again very high altitude battlefields that or battle spaces where war is difficult, and that's why it's the terrain and the topography that has kept the other side, or limited the two sides or all sides from shooting at each other more frequently. So you can see that part very clearly. The bulk of it is Aksai Chin that sort of stretches all along the Ladakh area, and then there's this little snippet here that's also under Chinese control. Now, the border. So the blue border, the blue dotted line, is the line of control. The line that is referred to between India and China is called the line of actual control. And we'll get to the broader Indian-Chinese border map here. So this border from sort of where it says DBO city all the way to, let's say, the Myanmar border, crossing through Nepal and Bhutan and the Indian Northeast. That's all called a line of actual control. That's just sort of the terminology. Now, if that wasn't complicated enough, this area called the Shaksgam Valley is something that the Chinese controlled by default when the Brits left, but it was undemarcated. It wasn't sort of settled as to who actually controls it formally. So in 1963, Shaksgam Valley was handed over by the Pakistanis to the Chinese as part of sort of their, good neighborly relations, if you want to call it that. And so China's control over Kashmir is in three parts. So there's this little thing here, most of it is Aksai Chin, and then there's Shaksgam Valley. Now, finally, what you have is this gray area. This is high altitude, and this is what many have called the highest battlefield on the planet. It's called the Siachen Glacier area. This was sort of a no man's land where nobody really went for a very long time because the militaries did not have the gear and whatnot. And if you notice, the line of control does not connect all the way formally to the Aksai Chin region. So there's a break between the blue dotted line and the Aksai Chin region. And so this area was sort of gray zone. I guess that's why the designers used gray color for this map. Until 1984. In 1984, there was the Pakistanis were caught off guard, and the Indians formally took over this region. There's been a lot of fighting. There have been permanent stationing of forces. It costs a lot of money. It has cost a lot of lives on both sides because here soldiers from both sides die less of shooting at each other and more from just the cold, just the frostbite. So that's your Kashmir. I'm going to move along because we have some ground to cover. So, okay, now let's overlay sort of water here. And I'm sure you've heard of in recent weeks and months that there's this India as part of the response. So one response was kinetic, which led to the 87-hour war between May 8th and I guess 11th or something like that. And so the other part was the Indians said, we are holding the Indus Waters Treaty that was signed in 1960 and facilitated by the World Bank at the time. We're going to hold it in abeyance. In other words, we're suspending it in response to what they say that Pakistan supported terrorist attack in the city of Pahalgam that led to this latest conflagration. So notice the rivers that go. And so it's important to understand, so the Indus River is a river that runs through pretty much the entire geography. You can see it on your map here. And actually it originates in Chinese territory, running through Indian-controlled Kashmir, then to Pakistani controlled Kashmir, and then making its way all the way down through the full length of Pakistan, and then it sort of descends into the Arabian Sea. Now there are associated rivers as well. So what you have is 5 rivers: Jhelum, Chenab, Ravi, Sutlej, and Beas. Now I'm sure many of you have heard the region, which is, there's a Pakistani Punjab, and then there is an Indian Punjab. Punjab is literally the land of 5 rivers. Ab is water, and Punj means 5. And so this region where these 5 rivers are concentrated is largely called Punjab. And now what happened as part of the treaty in 1960 it was a water sharing treaty, that who would use which rivers. The Indus was along with Jhelum and Chenab were given to Pakistan, whereas Ravi, Sutlej, and Beas was given to India. Now, mind you, they crisscross and they're in both countries, but that was sort of the water sharing mechanism. I'm so used to the word power sharing. So I just wanted you guys to understand that, laying the water issue over land and how complicated this entire thing becomes. Okay, so I thought it would be useful for us to also understand that for the first time since 1971, that was the last major war that the two countries fought. This was the first time, this May, that the Indians and Pakistanis fought all along their international boundary. The international boundary sort of starts at the Arabian Sea, the mouth of the Arabian Sea, separating the two countries, going all the way up, connecting to the line of control where you enter the Kashmir region that is divided between India and Pakistan. Most conflicts, most fighting between the two sides has been over the decades has been limited to the line of control. Occasionally, when major wars have happened, so and we'll go through that chronology later on, but occasionally, say the first war in 47, 48, 65, 71, those three wars, they were fought all along the international boundary. And so it wasn't limited to Kashmir only. It starts in Kashmir along the line of control, and then it spreads. But those have been rare occasions. That's why what happened in May is so important, that for the first time in nearly a half a century, in 50 years, you had the two sides literally firing at each other's mainlands, if you will. So and you notice the targets, you have air bases and areas where militant groups have sanctuary in Pakistan. So those are that's the red areas where they struck using drones and whatnot, and missiles and fixed wing aircraft with standoff munitions. Likewise, in yellow are the areas that the Pakistanis, tried to hit or hit. Same thing for the Indians. I mean, not, this is a compilation of everything that was reported. That's why this map says activity reported as opposed to confirmed hits. Okay, so let's move on. Now, this is the full length of the India-China border and how it intersects with the Pakistani, with Kashmir and the whole India-Pakistan dynamic. If you notice, as we talked earlier, there's the Aksai Chin, that's part of Kashmir that China controls, and then there's Demchok down there. And then that line of actual control runs all along the India-China border. And then there's this, long region of Nepal. And then you have a little bit of Indian territory. And then you have Bhutan, and then you have the Indian Northeast. There's 7 regions up there, particularly Arunachal Pradesh, which is claimed by China. And over the decades, as I'll show in a later slide, the Indians and the Chinese have clashed, and they continue to, I mean, this is if you will, heavily deployed battlefield on a permanent basis. And Indians have their own deployments on their side and fortifications, and the Chinese have been enhancing them as well. So I just wanted to give you a big picture. What does how we were talking about India, Pakistan, but I want to connect the geography to India, China. Now, before we go to the next slide, I want you to pay attention to the area that is sort of snuggled between Nepal and Bhutan on the Indian side. Much of that area until 1975 was an independent kingdom called Sikkim. And Sikkim decided to join the Indian Union in 1975, and it became part of India. And that sort of area, so this sort of corridor became much more bigger. It was strategically important for the Indians to have that, because otherwise they had that narrow, if you can see the narrow region between the Indian Northeast, sandwiched between the Indian Northeast, and this is Bangladesh here, Bhutan and Nepal, and the rest of mainland India. That's called the Siliguri corridor. It's kind of like a chicken neck in sort of in its shape, and it's sort of a choke point where, which is why the Indians were so interested in Sikkim. And we'll get into sort of more recent clashes in this area. So this is something that, is a vulnerability point. And more recently, in the past few, let's say, months, there have been reports that World War II era air bases have been opened on both sides of the India-Bangladesh border, and there's growing Chinese influence in Bangladesh as well. And Nepal is kind of like divided in terms of spheres of influence. The southern parts are more areas where India has more influence. The northern parts, there's a bit of Chinese influence, and Bhutan is contested territory as well. So you can see how India, this is a very, very precarious situation for India to keep the, pardon my language, the Chinese dog off their lawn, if you will. Moving along. Okay, so this is what is happening since 2022. So there's been India has embarked upon a massive military reorg and modernization effort. They didn't have something called a Joint Chief Command. So they created that. They modeled it after sort of the Brits and the Canadians with the rank of Chief of Defense Staff. Essentially, the Chief of Defense Staff is the boss of all the three service chiefs. And so that position was recently created. Let's say, I forget the actual date, it's probably like 5 years ago, maybe. But really what the whole effort was is to sort of overhaul the various theater commands and whatnot, because over the decades, like any bureaucracy, if you don't sort of overhaul it, it tends to become bloated and you sort of add more directorates and offices. So now there's a big modernization effort underway organizationally and, of course, from the point of view of firepower. So if you look at those three theater commands, these are now the integrated theater commands that are being developed. Notice two of them are, one is in Jaipur. Jaipur is like in a region that sort of is Pakistan specific. Lucknow is where sort of think of it as sort of the hub for all the forward deployment on the Chinese border. And then there's Karwar, which is on the west coast of India, India's coastline, though India's west coastline on the Indian Ocean. And that's more of a naval power projection capability. Until fairly recently, the Indian Navy had the smallest budget, and that's why India wasn't sort of this projecting power into the Indian Ocean, as is sort of expected by the United States as part of the whole Indo-Pacific Command restructuring of what used to be PACOM, PACOM only Pacific Command. And so this Karwar is going to be an integrated theater command with the lead being taken by the Navy. If you notice, there's a bunch of islands that were largely held, penitentiaries back in the days of the British. They're called the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. They kind of like run parallel to sort of the territory that sticks out, from Myanmar and then Thailand, entering Malaysian territory and Indonesian territory. Those areas in the local language and local parlance back in the day was called Kalapani. Kala means black, pani means water, black water. So basically, because it was an area where people were exiled or jailed or whatever back in the days of the British. But since independence, these have become very strategic areas for Indian military presence, and they're also being beefed up. These are, also very sophisticated. They have their own command structures, but they're going to be synced into the integrated theater command in Karwar. And my sense is that at some point there's going to be a fourth command and let's take it as a forecast, that's going to sort of be on the Bay of Bengal, on this coast, on India's east coast, especially with the way Bangladesh has gravitated away from India with the fall of the government back in last August, and China gaining ground, and there's some overtures towards Pakistan as well. And of course, with Myanmar falling apart and the five different rebellions there. So I just wanted us to understand that this is what India is trying to do as part of its own national security and national defense strategy, but also trying to sort of up its game in order to play with the United States as part of the Quad, as part of the Indo-PACOM command structure, which is, you can see that this is a work in progress. Okay, so let's look at the Chinese strategy. I'm sure you've come across the term string of pearl strategy. That is what, we call China's strategy for the Indian Ocean. Essentially, it was dependent on ports when it started. So Chinese, developing ports in Bangladesh, the port of Chittagong, there's the port of Kiautpyu in Myanmar, then the Hambantota in Sri Lanka, and then there's this unpronounceable port in the Maldives Islands, and then Gwadar, which is, this big facility on the Arabian Sea, not far from the Iranian border, that the Chinese have leased, have a very long-term lease, multi-decade lease. I've been trying to confirm whether it is actually a 99-year lease. I can't seem to confirm that, but sounds like, nobody wants to confirm it. We'll take it that it is a very multi-decade lease of this port. Right now, it's for commercial activity, but eventually, obviously, if you're the Chinese and you want to develop power projection capabilities, your biggest ally is Pakistan, so you want to turn this into a naval outpost of some sort. So that's sort of a strategy. There's been some setbacks to this strategy partly because Myanmar, Pakistan's turmoil over the last 20 years, at the financial, economic level, security level, political turmoil, the spillover from the U.S. war in Afghanistan, the ongoing conflict with India. So that's sort of one setback to the Chinese strategy. At the same time, you have the Myanmar falling apart, and so that's also a setback. Then Sri Lanka defaulted, on its loans. I think it was like 2 years ago, and that was also a major setback for the Chinese, because and there's sort of a rhyme and reason here. This isn't happening just as a coincidence. The strategy of the Chinese is they go into countries that are, for a lack of better term, malleable. And what do I mean by that? I mean that they need help, and therefore they're willing to work with the Chinese. But instead of that help strengthening those countries, they render them much more weaker. That's, many authors have called it Chinese debt trap diplomacy. Others disagree with that term, but without getting into the semantics, you get what I mean. I mean, there is I mean, this isn't just in Asia. I mean, you can go to Africa, you can see the example of Zambia. It's the same thing, it's playing out. It's just the way in which the Chinese engage with those countries. It's sort of, think of it as an extractive sort of strategy. Okay. It's important to understand the place of Myanmar and why today what is happening with 5 different rebel groups, along the Indian border, along the border with Thailand, China, even Bangladesh, and other parts of Myanmar along the coast with the Indian Ocean, are in control of large swaths of territory that the military government just has fallen out of the writ of the military government. Because this part of the string of pearls strategy had land-based segments, and one of which is CMEC, China-Myanmar Economic Corridor. You can see it runs from Kunming which is a very strategic location from a geoeconomic point of view for China. And this was a shortcut to sort of bypass the Straits of Malacca and build this corridor running through Myanmar and coming out into the Indian Ocean and developing those ports. It has another sort of line that was supposed to be upgraded before the war began. I have no idea what is the status of that other line that's in the dotted purple line, but you get my point that the Chinese have invested heavily. So this is sort of how China projects into the Indian Ocean, via land, because it's not contiguous to the, it's not a literal state of the Indian Ocean basin. Okay, moving forward. Okay, so this is sort of the Belt and Road Initiative in South Asia. This is a map where you can see from Kunming to Xi'an to Urumqi to Kashgar, and then the orange area is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor running all along the length of Pakistan all the way to Gwadar, and then we just talked about the China-Myanmar corridor, which is shown here in green, and then it extends to Chittagong in Bangladesh. I mean, this is all sort of, think of this as theoretical. This is not operational. This is sort of an aspired sort of, if in a future that what will it look like if it was fully operational? And then, connecting to Sri Lanka, the Maldives, back to Pakistan. So another sort of zooming out and looking at both the the Myanmar corridor and the China-Pakistan corridor. I also wanted to show that how it sort of, there's gas and oil pipelines as well that are running through Myanmar that they've been developing. I have to be honest, I haven't looked at the recent status of those gas and pipelines. I'm assuming that the Chinese are no longer working on it or have slowed down the work given the turmoil in the country. But this is energy is a big part of this. So it's not just transportation infrastructure for trade purposes and export purposes. It's also very much, oil and gas pipelines that are part of the grand strategy, if you will. And notice it doesn't stop at Kunming. It goes to Nanning, which is almost sort of, again, moving further east, in southeast in China. And that's another map of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. It just sort of helps to see how it runs through. This is railroad. Many of these places are also have, sublines. This is just the main line. You can go to this China-Pakistan Economic Corridor website maintained by the Pakistani government, and they have a far more detailed map. And I didn't think it was useful for our purposes today, so I just stuck with this one. Okay, we're done with geography. Let's just run through why is it that the Indians and the Pakistanis continue to battle it out and there's no end in sight. So and there's some key historical points that I've already touched upon briefly, but I want to go in a little bit more detail. So India and Pakistan are given independence by Britain in 1947 August. And so what happens is that the area that we now call Kashmir in the map that I showed you, that whole, let's just call it sort of the old princely state of Jammu and Kashmir that was part of the British Empire without its modern day divisions. That was sort of left alone. It was not part of what was called the Radcliffe Award, which sort of demarcated or partitioned British India into the Republic of India and, Pakistan at the time. And because it's Muslim majority, the Pakistanis naturally, because Pakistan was founded on the principle that the Muslim majority areas of British India would become Pakistan. Well, there was sort of a dilemma there, which is that there are a lot of Muslim majority areas in India British India that did not become Pakistan. So it was a very complicated affair. So you had modern day Bangladesh used to be East Pakistan until 71, and you had what was called West Pakistan, what is now essentially, modern day Pakistan. But Kashmir was not part of it. Now, it was not part of India, was not part of it. The ruler of Kashmir decided that he would sign accession documents and he joined the Indian Union. That was obviously unacceptable for the Pakistanis. And it's not just about religion or ethnicity. It's literally about strategy. It's literally about geopolitics. Uh, this is where the head waters of the Indus water and its tributaries they emanate from. And it was also about strategic depth in a sense. So that was sort of the impetus for the Pakistanis to start to basically launch an attack using both irregulars, tribal, if you will, militias. There were no Islamist militants back in that day, but people were motivated by religion. And of course, they augmented what was a very small army that had been, because there was a division of the old British Indian Army into the armies of Pakistan and India. And Pakistani army was weak, as was the whole Pakistani state. So they needed sort of that irregulars. And it became part of the Pakistani MO to use irregulars or militias or guerrilla groups, and in modern parlance, they became, jihadists and Islamist militants. So this goes back to that. So what happened was the the area that Pakistan was able to take was in this war in 1947-48, and the line of control emerged, and its vagueness emerged in the aftermath of this war. So it begins very much right after independence, of like I would say a few months after independence. Um, you get to 1960s, the mid 1960s, the Pakistanis said, looked at this, looked at the map, and said, uh, hey, we were able to take up like a third of Kashmir, uh, and we just ceded territory 2 years ago to the Chinese as well. The Chinese claim this place, so maybe there's an opportunity here to grab more territory using the same combine of irregulars and and of course there was a local indigenous uprisings as well by the Muslim population, some of whom wanted to join Pakistan, at least in those days. And so they tried again a second time in 1965. It resulted in utter failure because the Indians expanded the war to the broader international boundary, and it wasn't limited to the Kashmir region. So there are no sort of changing of borders. The borders remain the same as they were in 48, but you have another war. So give it another 6 years or 5 years. At the same time as the Pakistanis are trying to take over more of Kashmir, they uh, are facing what is an ethno-separatism on their eastern wing in Bangladesh. Now, bear in mind that there's about 1,000 miles of territory that separates it. And so East Pakistan was an exclave of, Pakistan. And so there's resupply issues. It's a different ethnicity, different language, different script, just a whole different geopolitical cultural environment and they formed the majority. So the ethnic Bengalis formed the majority of the Pakistani population. And it was their political principles who were the driving force in the movement to found Pakistan during the days of the British. So they're getting shortchanged, and so they're saying, "Hey, we form the majority, and we don't have any share of power over here. West Pakistan dominates us." So they have that problem running as well. So now the Pakistanis say, okay, well, we failed with taking more territory in Kashmir in 1965. but we have this problem, so let's put the Kashmir problem on ice. I mean, it's literally a frigid region anyway. And so let's focus on suppressing this uprising. And ultimately, in 1971, it resulted not just in civil unrest, but the Pakistani military engaged in a very brutal crackdown, killing a lot of people. There were a lot of human rights abuses, according to documents, as many as at least 100,000 women were raped by Pakistani soldiers. It was ugly. And there was a lot of refugees spilling over into different parts of India. Now, if you think of India's border with Bangladesh, it's kind of like surrounds the northern part of Bangladesh. Literally, except for that tiny part in the east that borders Myanmar, it's literally Indian territory surrounding Bangladesh on land. And then you have the Bay of Bengal, which is that part of the Indian Ocean. So there are a lot of refugees running into India. And so this becomes a huge crisis, and also becomes an opportunity for the Indians to sort of say, okay, we have a problem on our western flank, but what if we supported this rebellion and it became an independent state? And that's basically what happened. The Pakistanis lost that war. They tried to distract the Indians from helping the Bengalis, or the freedom movement at the time. But and they basically opened another front on their western border that was sort of like out of the frying pan into the fire kind of situation. And so again, it amounted to a defeat. In fact, it was a really bad defeat. As many as 90,000 Pakistani troops became prisoners of war. They surrendered. And it was a very bad time for Pakistan. Pakistan lost an entire wing, huge chunk of territory, the majority of its population, to a new country. So you fast forward, you come to 84. I'll just quickly go through this. Remember the gray area? In fact, I'll go back to that map so that we can sort of all reference it together. This gray area, this called the Siachen Glacier, well, that's what was taken over by Indian troops in an operation called Operation Meghdood. It was a secret operation. Well, I just noticed a typo in Meghdood, but that's okay. So by the time the Pakistanis realized the Indians had captured the heights, so the area is not fully, you can't think of it as fully under Indian control, but they control the strategic heights, which allows them to control a large part of the territory. The Pakistanis are at a lower altitude, but it's still an open battle space. The Pakistanis and Indians have tried since 84 to kind of like come to some sort of a modus vivendi on how to do it, and de-escalate tensions, at least in that sort of really small area. You can't solve the whole dispute of Kashmir, but can we reach something? But that hasn't worked. You fast forward, another 14 years, and then what you have is both countries finally came out of the closet. Everybody knew that India had nuclear weapons and Pakistan had nuclear weapons, but it was first India tested in May of 1998, and within a few days, the Pakistanis tested as well, both becoming overt nuclear armed nations, and that added this sort of exponentially increased the risk of conflict between the two countries. That said, the two countries have there's sort of this mutually assured destruction doctrine in play here, that's worked and has prevented the two sides from going too far. And this latest conflict, which is why we're having this conversation, is a major test. It's adding stress and strain to that period of calm where both sides avoided escalating beyond a certain point because they knew that the other side had nukes. Last thing on this slide is something called the Kargil War, and I'll show you the area on the map in just a minute here. In 1999, during the winter, the Indian military would sort of descend from the mountain peaks in a certain part of Kashmir along the border with Pakistan, thinking that, okay, you know what, we don't need to keep soldiers up there. Nobody's going to come in there. The line of control has held for a long time. But what the Pakistanis did is they, again, using irregulars, this time jihadist groups that they were already supporting in all across India throughout the 90s. But in 99, they also augmented that guerrilla force with regular troops, like let's just say somewhere, you know, as much as 10,000 troops that were sent for this operation to capture heights on the Indian side in the Kargil sector. That was during the winter. When the Indian forces came back in the spring, back to their posts, they saw that had been taken over. That's when they found out that these people had infiltrated. And that started what was called the Kargil War. It was a mini war during the summer of 1999. The Clinton administration mediated eventually a ceasefire, but by that time, the Indians had basically expelled the infiltrators back to the Pakistani side. It was another loss for Pakistan. So let me just show you where this is on the map. So if you notice, this is Kargil. I don't know if you guys can see my cursor here, but it's where you have line of control and the blue dotted line, and there's a square. It's called Kargil. That's where this war. That's the sector in where the 99 war took place. Okay, so quickly, we're running out of time. So I also want to run through the history of sort of Pakistanis enabling jihadist groups to wage, you know, urban terrorism in India. And so there were all sorts of jihadist outfits, at least four major ones, and then other smaller ones that throughout the 90s were sent in. I mean, notice that it begins in 1990, and it's for a reason, because Soviet troops had left Afghanistan in 89, and the Pakistani American Saudi joint strategy of using Islamist militants to fight the communist regime and its Soviet backers had worked. So the Pakistanis repurposed that strategy and switched it over to Kashmir, saying if we can force the Soviets out, then you know maybe we can make some headway against the Indians. We now have all these trained people, and some of them are, you know, can be repurposed. Not all of them, because a lot of them were you know, they were Arabs or didn't even speak the Pakistani or the Indian language, so you couldn't use them to. I mean, there were those as well, but they were fewer in numbers. So that's what they did, and fortuitously for the Pakistanis were actually on one level caught off guard because they were focusing so much on Afghanistan. You know, part of Operation Cyclone that the CIA was running for much of, you know, that decade between 79 to 89 until the Geneva Accords led to the withdrawal of Soviet troops. The Pakistanis didn't realize that there was an indigenous uprising taking place on the Indian side of Kashmir. And when they did, they said, you know, this is great. Let's just take these guys, insert them into that. So what they did is they turned what we would deem normally as an indigenous uprising for freedom, a nationalist struggle, into a sort of a transnational jihadist, because these guys were transnational jihadists. They had all sorts of other agendas. And the Pakistani intelligence service was just sort of saying, you know, load buses and train them, and they're trained, just send them over to the other side to continue, you know, what do they care? I mean, these were seen as sort of globe-trotting jihadists. And so they were shown greener pastures, for a lack of a better metaphor. So that happened all throughout the 1990s. But in 1999, the Kargil War was the culmination of that effort. After that, and right shortly after 9/11, 9/11 happens in September. In December, in early December, there is a major attack, an unprecedented attack on the Indian parliament by a small task force of Pakistani-based militants that attacked the Indian parliament. That led to the biggest mobilization by the Indians, and that led to an eyeball-to-eyeball situation, if you will, a standoff, a major standoff that was then, you know, brought, you know, tensions were lowered, and it was diffused with very heavy involvement of the Bush administration that did not want Pakistan and India to go at each other when at a time when they were waging the war on terror and they were still planning Iraq. So that was an interest of the Bush administration at the time that prevented it. So after that, in 2003 to 2008, we enter in this weird period of sort of normalized relations where there's a lot of people-to-people contact. People are traveling from India to Pakistan. Pakistanis are going to India. There are cultural exchanges, movie stars and soap actors and, people who are, rock stars from both sides going at and visiting. So it was a very unusual period. And in fact, this was during sort of the Musharraf regime, the former Pakistani military dictator, General Pervez Musharraf, whom you probably all remember. And believe it or not, in that short period, the two sides actually came very close to a blueprint on how to solve Kashmir, how to sort of draw the line and just sort of bring that settlement to an end. BBC on its website still has a good report on that plan. It's called the Musharraf Plan by many people, and but it never went anywhere because Musharraf was overthrown, had to forced out of office, and democratic politics came back to Pakistan after 9 years. And then we had the Mumbai attacks. I'm sure you guys all remember the Mumbai attacks. And that's 2008. I don't want to get into the details. Again, it led to a major standoff that was again diffused by, it was a situation that happened during the, twilight days of the Bush administration. And really, it was something that was then managed by the Obama administration. And, the two sides once again dodged a bullet. It was such a situation, was such a shock, and it led to the Pakistanis sort of really cracking down on many of these people, but not to the extent that you could bring an end to Pakistan-based terrorism in India down to zero. The levels declined, the cross-border infiltrations could decline, but it still remained there. So we got a good 5 years out of that. By 2013, 2012, you could see this thing starting up again, but with less frequency. And there were a number of attacks, and I don't want to get into the details of those. But in 2016, there was a particular attack in a place called URI. It's pronounced as Uri in India. And if memory serves me, it was a brigade headquarters in the Indian Army, and it was attacked by a terror group. That's when, for the first time, and this is now 2 years into the current Prime Minister Narendra Modi and his right-wing, Bharatiya Janata Party, consolidating, power. The BJP had been growing since the 90s, and in between, the BJP ruled for a period of time as well. But under Modi, this was Modi's first term. He was 2 years into office, and he decided that the only way to sort of stop this is to, cross the line and hit them. So until now, until 2016, the Indians refrained, even at the height of the Kargil War, which lasted for several months, when the Pakistanis and Pakistani-backed militant groups had taken over heights inside India. There were strict orders, and it was the BJP government at the time as well, led by former Prime Minister A.B. Vajpayee, who gave strict orders to the Indian military that I don't want planes to cross the line of control because that would lead to an escalation. So the idea was to push these guys out and remain in a defensive posture. That thing was completely done away with in 2016 after that terror attack. And when we had what the Indians called a surgical strike, in common language, it would be a commando raid across not too far into Pakistan on land by special forces, striking at what they called a launch pad, not a launch pad, or sort of a halfway house for people who are destined to cross the border and engage in terrorist activity on the Indian side. So that was the first time that the Indians pushed back and crossed the border. Now, what that did is that set up a precedent. In 2019, there was another attack on a paramilitary forces bus on the Indian Kashmir. And this time, since you've already done a special operations raid, and so there's pressure, you've set a precedent, and you're sort of forced up the next rung of the escalatory ladder. So what you had was Indian airstrikes, not on Pakistani Kashmir, but deep inside Pakistan. And that led to a dogfight, a shooting down of a MiG-21 of the Indians. The pilot was captured. It ended very quickly. In the beginning, we thought that all hell is about to break loose. This is the first time in 50 years that there's a dogfight between the Indians and the Pakistani Air Forces. Oh my God, they have nukes. What, are we looking at nuclear war? But it ended very quickly, and partly because the Pakistanis decided that they would serve tea to be nice to this captured pilot, serve him tea, and then send him home. And then we get another sort of 8 years of calm, if you will. No, not 8 years, sorry. My math is off. 6 years of calm, and that's when this latest attack happens. So you go from a special operations forces attack in terms of the Indian response to airstrike to now a full campaign of striking across Pakistan. I showed you the map of the various areas that the Indians struck and the Pakistanis retaliated, and it involved aircraft, drones, and missiles of different types. Okay, that's as far as India-Pakistan is concerned. Quickly through the history of Indian-Chinese conflict, 1954, India says, okay, China, Tibet is yours. We're good with that. By 1959, the situation in Tibet becomes really bad because the Chinese are suppressing, and the Dalai Lama, he seeks refuge in India, and that's where relations between India and China begin to deteriorate. And give or take another 3 years later, India and China have a war. The only major war that they fought, it led to an Indian defeat, and it's in that 1962 war that much of this territory, and it's disputed even within India, there's a disagreement on just how much territory the Chinese do control. So the government is sort of saying, no, it doesn't control that much. But then there are journalistic reports and analyses that come out and say, oh, this area is also under, the line of actual control has been pushed deeper into India. After that, you get 5-year period of respite. 1967, there are clashes in the Sikkim border, that area between Bhutan and Nepal. And then you have clashes in the Northeast in 75. We're into the 80s, and towards the end of the 80s, we thought we're going to have another war between India and China. Thankfully, it didn't happen. By the early 90s, there's a major attempt by the Indians and the Chinese to de-escalate and figure out how, well, the Chinese control X, the Indians control Y. We're never going to agree on that, but can we come up with an arrangement where we just don't shoot at each other? And then that's when they decided that they agreed that the soldiers would not use firearms against each other, even though that they have firearms, but they would not. Which is why in that clash in 2020, you had a situation where it wasn't shooting at each other. It was the use of clubs, but on the part of the Chinese with barbed wire. And that's what they fought with. I mean, stones and clubs and whatnot. That was the whole 2020 clash, which is called the Galwan clash in the Western sector. Between the normalization period and the 2020, the latest clash, there were multiple, standoffs in multiple areas all along that, Himalayan frontier. So that's sort of a quick dive into the Indian and Chinese conflict history. I want to quickly sort of overlay the broader geopolitics here. What we have is a situation where um, India has tense relations with China. India has tense relations with Pakistan. China is Pakistan's ally and is deeply embedded into geoeconomically for the moment, not militarily, inside Pakistan. So this is sort of like a two-front two-front war or conflict from an Indian point of view. At a time when this is happening, uh, you wonder, what is the Chinese strategy here? It's certainly making its intentions on Taiwan very clear, where it's now normalized, where Chinese naval vessels and warplanes, they regularly go and encircle Taiwan. They are pushing into a confrontation with, definitely the Philippines, but also they're doing some activity that annoys the Vietnamese as well. They're now pushing into Japanese waters. That's the latest. And so, and last summer, in a joint exercise with the Russians, the Chinese fleet, it wasn't a big one, but it did exercises as far out as the Aleutian Islands, which is now we're going into Alaska and the U.S. sphere of influence, or sort of more closer to the U.S. in the west, in the eastern rim of the Pacific Basin. You also see, we talked about, the strategy in the Indian Ocean, what the Chinese have been doing. And I suspect that between the two, it became sort of an impetus for the Pentagon to say, well, there's the Fifth Fleet in Bahrain, in the Persian Gulf, and there's the Seventh Fleet in the Pacific, and the Indian Ocean, we don't have anything except for Diego Garcia, that is the largest facility. So it makes sense for these two theaters to become part of a singular command. So I think that the Chinese moves in both areas, in the Western Pacific Seaboard and the Indian Ocean Basin, sort of prompted that, or at least informed that decision. And of course, the need to bring India into the security architecture that is designed to counter China. Meanwhile, the Chinese are also pushing into Central Asia through the BRI, and I haven't talked about that, and that requires more time, but I do want to mention that they're investing a lot of money on that end, so something to keep in mind, especially given we're now what, almost 4 years out from the withdrawal from Afghanistan. So there's that aspect, and it not only does Chinese activity in Central Asia impact that region and Afghanistan, but also broader South Asia because of the linkages with Pakistan and so on and so forth. Ultimately, in a nutshell, how are the Chinese responding to the U.S. alignment with India? Well, I call it strategic poking on the Himalayas. You force the Indian military to deploy a chunk of resources for high altitude combat and permanent deployments there. That leaves little resources to project power in the Indian Ocean. Not that the Chinese are doing very great, on the economic front or even in the Indian Ocean, but it is a strategy to limit India's usefulness to the United States. In many ways, I've sort of already started off on my final slide, which you're seeing right now. And so what we have, this is the context. This is sort of the big strategic context of the U.S. China competition, in which this latest war of India and Pakistan has to be sort of looked at. That's sort of the wide angle lens that we need to use to understand the India-Pakistan war. You can't see it as just a bilateral dispute. It is that, but much, much more. I also wanted to, last point I wanted to mention is the it's not just in military terms that U.S. wants to align with India. In all things being equal, the United States wants to take some of that manufacturing bite out of China, that the Chinese manufacturing prowess, by shifting investments away from China into India to do some semblance of, or at least begin some semblance of manufacturing in India as an alternative. This is a long-term project. It's not easy to do given the business environment inside India. It's one of those places that's not, the best in terms of, the reports on, the ease of doing business in India aren't all that great. But that's sort of also part of the American strategy. While we think about the military strategy, there is an industrial strategy as well. That became complicated with the president's trade tariff strategy, and you probably saw or heard that whole thing about the president saying India can take care of itself. He was telling Steve Cook, the CEO of Apple, because Apple has been trying to said, okay, we can't do business there. So Apple has been sort of more accommodating, if you will, of sort of this administration's sort of push to, and not just this administration, but also the Biden administration's, that, hey, we want to limit investments and actually pull back on that. So NVIDIA, a company like NVIDIA, is saying, oh, this doesn't work for us. Apple has been accommodating. And then part of that accommodation is, well, we can go to India and manufacture some parts of the iPhone there. Well, guess what? The president said, I want that stuff being manufactured inside the United States because of his politics. So in other words, the domestic politics of the Trump administration are also having an impact on how the United States can align with India to counter China. And I'll leave it there. I think I took far longer than I had planned to, but I hope it was worth it.